Hi, everyone. It's a thrill and an honor to be here with you. I'm grateful to Peter and the Visit Flanders team for bringing us all together, to Anna Pollock for inviting me and the other international speakers. And most of all, I'm grateful to all of you for taking the time to be here in this vitally important exploration and conversation. It's a real possibility that we will look back at these 2 days and notice that this was a pivotal moment and that this was when everything really started to change for the better. It's a real possibility. So thank you for being here. The journey that I have made to get to be here with you started about 25 years ago when I had a perfectly good career in international marketing, and I started to notice that there were real fundamental problems and limitations with how we thought about our relationships with our customers, with our communities, with our employees. I started to notice, as so many have, that we were guided by a machine story, a story that tells us that everything in the world operates like a machine, especially our businesses, especially our economies. And in your work, this shows up as the belief that tourism is just a conveyor belt, right? And we want as many people to be run through that conveyor belt as possible. And your work is to turn those gears faster and faster to get more and more people to go through, right? It's a very simple story in which only productivity and profitability matter. But what we're starting to see is that that story is at the root of all major problems in society. Every major problem that we're facing, I believe, can be traced back to that limited story. And so I have dedicated my life and work for the past 20 years to a different story, a bigger story that's able to hold more complexity, more possibility, more of what we really want out of life. And that's a shift from a machine story to a living system story in which we see our organizations, our communities, ourselves, our families as living ecosystems that are capable of thriving. And so where Anna talks about flourishing and Daniel talks about regeneration, I like the word thriving, and even thrivability, creating the conditions for the ability for life to thrive at every level, for individuals, for organizations, for customers, for community, for the biosphere. And for me, there are 3 things required for that to become true. The first is that we have to be informed. We have to understand, what does it take for life to thrive? What are the conditions that we have to cultivate if we're going to enable life to thrive? I need a glass of water. I wonder would you help me with some water? Thank you. So the first thing is we have to know what's required. We have to be informed. The second thing is that we have to set a clear intention that we're trying to enable life to thrive. And up to now, we've set our intentions on something far smaller, far less than thriving. Things like productivity and profitability that are not bad in themselves, but if that's the limit of our intention, then we've seen that we get something disastrously less than thriving. And the final thing is that we have to recognize that thrivability is not a marketing campaign. It's not a project that we do and we're finished with it. It's a thank you. Thank you. Okay. It's an ongoing practice. It's a life practice, like a martial arts practice or a yoga practice or even a spiritual practice. That's a deepening into wisdom and compassion and the ability to sense what's needed and respond with effective action. It's an ongoing practice that's both individual and collective. So if we start with being informed, I'd like to offer what I have learned over my 20 years of focus and research, what I've learned about what it takes for life to thrive, whether we're talking about a rainforest or our bodies or our organizations and communities. So I'd like to offer the 4 fertile conditions that are necessary, that we have to cultivate if we're to enable life to thrive at all of those levels. I'd then like to share a story of a visitor economy organization in Montreal, a coalition of museums that has embraced this practice, this informed intention and practice of thrivability. And then I'd like to share a guiding framework that I hope will help you as you listen to the many stories over these 2 days to understand why those stories were successful. What were the fertile conditions that were being cultivated? And I hope that this framework will help you going forward as you initiate your own projects and develop your own success stories. Okay, so that's 4 fertile conditions, 1 story, and 1 guiding framework. Okay? But first, another sip. Okay. These 4 fertile conditions involve a very small amount of biology. And it's intuitive, and you will understand. You've got this, and there will not be a test. So don't worry. The first thing we need to know about thriving living systems is that there are individual parts in every living system. There are cells in our bodies, there are bees in a colony, there are trees in a forest, and many other organisms that make up the forest. And in our communities, there are the residents, the hosts, the enterprises, right? All the different people and businesses that make up the community. And we know from biodiversity that the more diverse or divergent those parts are, the more resilient and adaptive and creative the living system will be. So in our communities, we want everyone to be able to bring their best ideas, their best contributions, their full passion, right? So far, so good. And actually, I should mention that the machine story would tell us this is not true. The machine story would tell us that the most efficient pathway to profitability and productivity is a McDonald's and a Starbucks on every corner. And if there are people involved still, that they would be uniform and replaceable cogs in the machine, right? So we start to notice the difference between the 2 stories. So the second thing we need to know about thriving living systems is that those parts come together in patterns and structures of relationship and interaction. So in our bodies, we have a skeletal structure that holds us up and keeps everything in place. And we also have the circulatory system and the digestive system and other systems that allow life to flow through, right, in a dynamic pattern. In a bee colony, the bees have that structure, the hive, that holds them together, keeps things in place, and supports them in being and work together. Bees also have these funny little dances that they do. So there's one dance that communicates to the other bees, hey, I found some food over here. And there's another dance that communicates, I found a good place for the next hive over here. So it's structures and patterns of interaction. In a forest, underneath the trees, in the soil, there are structures of roots and a network of bacteria and fungus that is connective and supportive, that holds up and enlivens the whole forest. And in our communities, we have the infrastructure of bridges and roads and waterways and hotels and restaurants that hold us together. And then within that, we have something like that mycelial underground network of the trees that is the pattern of our interactions and our conversations, much more like the mycelial network than it is like a conveyor belt, right? That the machine story would tell us. We're just pushing people through as fast as we can. So here's the first paradox that we find in living systems, and there are many paradoxes. We want as much stability, like that skeletal system that we have, but we also want as much flow, and we want it to be as dynamic as possible. And here's where the practice comes in, that practice of wisdom and compassion and sensing what's needed, sensing how much of each is needed on an ongoing basis if the living system is to be resilient and adaptive and creative. The third thing we need to know is that those parts come together in patterns of relationship in a way that creates a new wholeness, an emergent level of life, with new capabilities and characteristics that you don't find at the level of the parts. So you are more than just a collection of cells, right? You can think and you can feel and you can move, and these are things that happen at the level of the whole of you, not at the level of your cells. These are emergent capabilities and characteristics. In a bee colony, together, the bees are able to maintain the temperature inside of the hive structure within 2 degrees. No matter what temperature it is outside the hive, it always stays roughly the same temperature. And there isn't one bee that's there saying, oh, it's getting hot. It's an emergent property that the bees are capable of only together. There are books being written now about swarm intelligence and how together the bees are far more intelligent than any one little bee brain is capable of, right? In a forest, we find the emergent capability of rain. Rain is a symbiotic biological phenomenon. Rain is something that happens as an emergent property of the living systems and other weather patterns. And in our visitor experience, we come together in our communities and we offer an experience that is Bruges. This happy woman is experiencing Bruges not only in the delicious chocolate that she ate, and not only in the wonderful hotel where she slept, and not only in her strolls through the town, but all of it comes together in a coherent, cohesive, convergent experience that is Bruges. And here's another paradox of living systems. Even though we want as much diversity and divergence at the level of the parts, we want everyone to bring their best, most unique contributions, we want it in service of a convergent whole. If the living system, the living community is to be resilient and adaptive and creative. So you remain recognizably you, even as your cells are continuously being replaced, even as they're doing all kinds of different things, but at the level of the whole of you, there's consistency and convergence and coherence. And in human communities, the way that we achieve this level of coherence and wholeness is through shared story. We've heard a lot about that this morning, the power of story. So it's this that brings us together and converts us from a shapeless crowd of people to something bigger than ourselves together, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we start to discover new capabilities. We start to be able to offer visitors the experience of Bruges. And again, the machine story would say, this is not important, this is not valid. We just need kind of the cookie cutter, generic places that we can push people through. But we know, we've heard all morning about the power of the DNA, right, of a place. That's what this is about. So if we stop here with these first 3 fertile conditions, we could be talking about my car. My car has individual parts, and they all do different things. They're in relationship with me and with the road and with each other. They come together, and now they're called a car altogether, right? And they have the emergent capability of moving me around town. But my car will never have a great idea. It will never heal itself. It will never generate a whole new car for me. It will never adapt to completely unforeseen circumstances. My car will never comfort me and be my friend. So for all of those things, we need something else, something that's the difference between me and my car, right? And when I started studying and researching biology to figure out what is the rest of the story, what do we need to understand, there were just a few biologists who talked about this something else. And they talked about it as a self-integrating property. So it's kind of a complicated sounding phrase that means by itself, the living system integrates divergent parts into patterns and structures of relationship in a way that creates a new convergent and emergent whole by itself. It's self-organizing, self-managing, self-healing. So when I saw this, I thought, isn't that just life? Whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive, isn't that the difference between me and my car somehow? And we don't have to know what that is. What is life? Where does it come from? We're kind of in the right place maybe to reflect on that, but we don't have to. But we do have to acknowledge that it's there and it plays a role, that there is life and aliveness in ourselves, in our enterprises, and in our communities. Because if we don't, then we risk staying with that story in which we are the drivers of the machine and we can control everything. And the reality is that we will never do as good a job as life does. Life is elegant and graceful in its self-organization. And the stories we heard today, especially from the Prof. Tunen projects, were of self-organization, and it was effortless and elegant and joyful and creative. So this is what happens when we shift our stance, our position, our role from controlling everything to being stewards. Stewards is a funny word in English. It doesn't usually translate very well. The way I think of it is that it's a combination of reverence and responsibility. So reverence for the magic of something that's alive, that is beyond our comprehension, beyond our control. And even though it's beyond our control, we still feel called to care. We still feel responsible to care and cultivate those fertile conditions. So this is the stewardship that seems to be called for in our communities and in your roles within the tourism business and world. So here's how they all come together, those 4 fertile conditions within the world of the visitor economy. These are life's universal design principles. Those individual people, residents, hosts, and the businesses and enterprises that they create together as the diverse parts. The structures and patterns and flow of relationships, how they are supported and connected in being in relationship with each other in a way that creates an emergent DNA, a story of place, building on the story that has always been there and evolving it into the future, and all of it, ideally, enlivened by life, supported by us and enlivened. So I really love that Visit Flanders uses the metaphor of the tree, as do I, in a very similar way. So here's how I think about it. I imagine that the people, those parts, those residents and hosts and enterprises are represented by the roots of the tree. And that in offering up that visitor experience, it's like the branches and leaves and fruit, the offering and inviting that visitor into the ecosystem. And then the trunk of the tree represents that supportive, connective infrastructure where we find each other and we find encounter. What I find especially interesting about the metaphor of the tree is that most of the trunk of the tree is dead. There's a thin layer of living tissue just under the bark called the cambium, and this is where life flows from roots to leaves and leaves to roots. So most of the infrastructure is actually dead. But it's necessary. The trunk is necessary to raise up those leaves to the light and life of the sun and bring it back in to feed the roots. And in the same way, in the visitor economy, in tourism, I think we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that those assets, the physical assets, are the industry. And they are necessary to connect us, to enable us to reach out and host people and host each other. But let's not forget that what we're really doing is hosting that flow of life between the placekeepers and the visitors. So now it's time for the story that I promised. This is 4 nature museums in Montreal, where I live. There's a botanical gardens, an insectarium, a planetarium, and a biodome. The biodome is 4 ecosystems recreated under one roof. So you can walk into the tropical rainforest with real plants and monkeys, and you walk into 3 others. So these 4 institutions were separate from each other and all owned by the city of Montreal. And at one point, a few years ago, the mayor decided to merge them administratively. And part of that was the machine story of efficiency. Why have 4 directors of human resources and administration when you can have 1 set of them? They're all nature museums. What's the difference? Let's just put them together. They were not very happy about this. These institutions, the people within them, all felt very different, with different scientific disciplines, different histories, different sizes. The planetarium was in a different part of town, so they weren't very happy with this merger. So then the mayor hired a new director to oversee the merged entity, and that director is visionary and creative, but he comes from the world of circus and dance. And so then they were afraid he was going to turn them into the next Cirque du Soleil. And these are scientists and educators who are really passionate about their scientific mission. The final blow came when this new director's mandate was to create one brand that would represent all of them together and that would really put Montreal on the map as a destination, right? And they were very skeptical of branding. They were pretty sure they would become McMuseums somehow. So my colleague and I were brought in to help them with this challenge. And we brought everyone together in conversation in different ways, including bringing all 450 people together for a day to explore those 4 fertile conditions that I've been telling you about. So we invited them in very participatory and creative and story-based ways to imagine together, what will it look like when each of you is able to bring the best of your talents and skills and passion and your divergence, and to be nourished in the process? What will it look like when your work is beautifully supported and held, and when information and trust and communication flows beautifully inside the organization and out, the pattern of relationships, to help them explore that convergent wholeness and what was the potential for it across these 4 entities that didn't see themselves as one yet. We didn't just ask them, what is the one product or service that you want to sell the world, right? Instead, we asked them, what is the one conversation you all want to have with the world? What's the one conversation you all want to have with the world? This is much more alive than what do you want to sell the world? And in all of it, we were inviting them to listen to what was needed so that they could respond with effective action, to be in service of what was alive in them and in the whole of them. So this is a quote from the assistant director. She said, we actually listened to what was in the center, to what the organization wanted to tell us. What does it want to become? It's a funny concept, but I think you do the same in communities as well. What is the story? What is the DNA? So based on what we heard, we drafted a manifesto, and we brought it back to them. Don't plan to read this, but we brought a draft manifesto. You can read it later if you'd like in the handouts. But we asked them, is this what you said? Does this feel accurate and authentic? And we brought it to the directors first, and they said, yes, it's really good. There's just one problem. You used the word life. And we don't talk about life, we talk about nature. Nature is out there, it's measurable, it's tangible, but life is kind of amorphous, it's intangible, it might even be spiritual. So could you just change that one word? And my colleague and the director and I, we all said, wow, this is really interesting. You know that most of you are biologists, right? And you're uncomfortable talking about life. If you can't talk about life, who can? And maybe there's a connection between our inability to talk about life and our decreasing ability to sustain life on the planet. Maybe this is the one conversation you need to have with the world. So this kind of challenged them. And we had to go through about 6 months of collective soul searching, more conversation, more exploration. And in the end, they came up with an identity for themselves that they will tell you is not a brand, it is a conversation, and it is a commitment. So together, they are now Espace pour la vie. They are the space for life. When I first heard this phrase, I thought, that's a wonderful way to translate the word thrivability. It doesn't translate very well into French. It's an invented word in English, but really what it's about is seeing our organizations and seeing our communities as a space for life in which we have the privilege of cultivating the fertile conditions for life to thrive at all of those levels. So I love that they were able to keep their divergence. They kept their individual identities, and within that, they make up a space for life together. Because of this process, they were able to, they were open to collaborative budgeting that they hadn't done before. They changed the way they conduct their meetings to make sure that they're far more alive and creative. They changed their organizational structure. So previously, human resources had been buried within finance and administration, which is very common in organizations. And instead, they brought it out and created one pillar of the organizational chart that is people and culture. They created one that is infrastructure and one that is visitor engagement. All of that in order to support them in listening to life and what's needed and responding with effective action. So there are two kind of favorite moments in this project, kind of punchline outcomes. One is that they had tried and failed for 7 years to raise enough money to renovate the planetarium, that poor lonely planetarium off on the other side of town. They never could raise the money. Within 1 year of launching this vision and this commitment and conversation, they were able to raise $190 million, build an entirely new planetarium alongside the other 3 institutions, and do several other major projects. So there's something really magnetic and compelling when we align with life. People feel that, and they're drawn to it, and their money is drawn to it too. The other thing that was my personal favorite moment in the project is when we brought everyone together again, all 450 people, to publicly announce the manifesto in front of the mayor and other dignitaries. At one point, there was one leader who was not a fan of this whole process. He was kind of the old guard, and everybody knew it, and he left soon after. But he was still there at this event. And at one point, this blue-collar worker, so just a low-level worker, stood up spontaneously and he said, I just want to say that this manifesto, these are our words. We said this, that means we have to do this. And these are not that guy's words, and he named that guy. These are not his words, these are our words. And I thought, this is what you want, right? In a community, for people to feel this is our story, and we have to live out the vision. We all have to make it happen. So that was my favorite moment. All right, so now I want to offer a guiding framework to help you listen for those fertile conditions and to offer some guidance as you go back into your own work and your own communities. So if we go back to our tree, and we want a little bit more detail, because it's nice to think about engaging the parts, but what does that mean? How do we do that? What's involved? So if we start with the roots, those residents and hosts and enterprises, the first fertile condition that we have to cultivate is the ability for people to find their mastery. We all want to do our jobs well. We want to make a contribution, right? And this is not in the kind of McDonald's model of everyone is replaceable, but we want to bring something of ourselves and learn continuously, like a master craftsman or an artisan. So the more we can create the conditions for that to be true in our organizations and in our communities, the more life people will bring. If we want even more passion and aliveness, then we also create the conditions for people to feel a sense of membership and belonging, so that they feel a connection to their colleagues, to their neighbors, to the visitors as well, right? And if we want outrageous levels of passion and commitment and loyalty, then we give people an opportunity to find a sense of meaning so that their work is contributing to something bigger than themselves. We all want that, right? It's different for everyone, but we can create the fertile conditions for people to discover that for themselves in our organizations and in our communities in some of the ways that we heard about this morning, engaging them in conversations to explore what that would look like for them. So if we go to the visitor experience and how do we invite them into this ecosystem and invite them to bring their life and their passion and aliveness, the first thing we need is to make some contribution, some outreach. And this is where we would normally be talking about our commodity. I've got beds, I've got food, right? But we need more than that. We don't want to be stuck with the commodity. We want to offer some contribution. I find that this language invites us to consider more in how we make our offering to the visitors. And if we don't get that right, then it's hard to really engage with the rest. So that's an important foundation. But if we want even more loyalty and enthusiasm, then we offer people a sense of community and conversation, and maybe even co-creation. I loved the story from Flanders Fields about the poppy seeds and how people could take those seeds back to their hometown and plant them and then share on Facebook the pictures of where they had planted them and that the map is now read. That's a beautiful example of engaging people, the visitor, so that they feel that they're also part of this living ecosystem. And I think it was also another beautiful example of offering people a heroic cause, so that visiting your area is somehow meaningful to them. It's somehow doing good or serving something that's bigger than themselves, right? If we can get that combination, all three of those together, then it's powerful and resilient and adaptive and creative. So you might notice that just like the trees, roots and branches are kind of mirror images of each other. The same is true in our organizations, in our communities, that what engages us has to be really connected to what engages those we're serving. They can't be cut off and separate, as they so often are. And so our task is to build that supportive and connective infrastructure to bring them together. And the first is the structure that we talked about. We do need to make sure that there are roads and spaces, places for us to meet. We have this structure that we need to bring our mastery in service of contribution, but we also need the systems of being in conversation. And we're discovering new ways to do that. We heard stories of engaging with visitors in really different types of conversation and engaging with residents as well. So these are new skill sets that we may have to develop, moving into this new way of being in tourism. And the final piece is story. Story as what holds it all together. And this is not a static, stagnant story that some marketing agency writes and it lives that way forevermore. This is a living story, an evolving, unfolding story. So most of all, this is about the disciplines and practices of continuously checking in on what is the story that we're living together, and are we living it coherently across all of these other aspects of our stewardship. So some of those things, you might notice the first column, those are quite tangible things that we can craft, we can build and design. And that middle column is more the how. These are things that we can co-create together with each other and with residents. And that final column, the why, that can only be cultivated and invited. That's where it's really that amorphous, maybe it's even spiritual part. But this is where we get into new skill sets of sensing what's arising here and what's alive. And all of that comes together in that practice of stewardship, that informed intention and practice of cultivating the fertile conditions for life to thrive in our communities. So all of this comes together at a time when there's such urgent need. We heard all morning, especially from Daniel, about the dire need for tourism to reinvent itself, not just to tweak at the edges, but to rethink what the role of tourism is in the world. So my belief is that we have to get more informed and more intentional about aligning with life so that hosts and visitors and other individuals can experience more aliveness, health, joy, justice, learning, self-expression, and self-awareness, so that enterprises achieve their intended purpose creatively, gracefully, and resiliently, while attracting and cultivating necessary resources, so that the community discovers more connectedness, creativity, resilience, and self-reliance. And so the biosphere is supported in its ability to be healthy and regenerative over time. This is what's at stake, and this is what's possible. So your work is vitally important in this reflection, these 2 days and beyond. So the question I'd like to leave you with is this one. As we have talked so far and heard presentations, the tendency is to bring it back to our own individual activities, but you have power together to affect change and transformation if you can come together in one conversation about what the role of tourism is and what it needs to be. So this is a question I would like to offer and leave with you, maybe encourage you to share your thoughts on the Post-it notes that keep being offered to you. But really, I hope that this is what we can explore together over these 2 days and beyond. What is the one conversation you all want to have with the world? Thank you.